Welcome, everybody. Come on in. The water's fine. Welcome to How to Capture Panoramas, Good, Better, and Best Methods. Please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. I'd like to know where you're tuning in from. I always like to know that. Feels good. Uh, I'm Matt Hill. I'm just going to give everybody a couple of seconds to get in here, and then we'll get right to it in about a minute. In the meantime, I'm going to just do a little bit of housekeeping while you guys let us know where you're tuning in from. This is a live webinar, but it is being recorded. And also, if you're watching this on the replay, thanks for watching. If you're here live, I really appreciate you being here. The reason that you're here live is probably because you want to interact with me. So please use the chat to talk with each other and use the Q&A function here on Big Marker to ask me questions directly. Today, I'm making the presentation. Martin will be here in the chat if you have technical questions about products, and he will answer them there. I'm going to handle all of the questions at the end. So please ask all of your questions, and I will definitely get to them. But we've got a lot of ground to cover, and I want to make sure that we get through all of the materials, and then I can answer your questions in depth, fully, and completely. Most of all, thank you for being here. Thanks for attending the Novoflex webinar series or watching the replay. So without further ado, let's take a peek at who is here. I just need to move this to another screen to take a look. So we have Pennsylvania, we have Houston, Lincoln, Nebraska, Long Branch, New Jersey, Tempe, Arizona. It's Paige from New Jersey. Hey, Paige. Buffalo, New York, British Columbia. Hey, Susan. Good to hear from you. And we have Niagara Falls, Ontario, that side, and Phoenix, and Denver. And we've got people from all over. This is incredible. I'm sure I saw some international people in there too. So I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Let's jump right into it. The title of this presentation, again, is How to Capture Panoramas, Good, Better, and Best Methods. Well, today I want to cover a bunch of things in the agenda here. So let me just move this over to where it's going to be big enough for me to read everything. First off, we're going to go over some simple tips just to get right into it and give you some takeaways immediately. Then we're going to talk about why we make panoramas. And then I'm going to give you a funny story, which is how I became a pano photographer in 18 easy steps. Then we're going to talk about getting started, and then we're going to get right into the building blocks of this, the good, the better, and the best options. So let's move on. Here's some tips to get started. I think most people, when they get started with panoramas, they try them handheld. And that's totally wonderful. Absolutely no judgments from me. That's exactly how I started. What you should do when you're doing handheld panos is, whether you're using a smartphone or using a camera, just practice staying level. It's at that point when you do your first really crooked pano and you have to crop a lot that you realize how important staying level is. Second is, of course, if you're doing it handheld, you're going to make a single row pano. You're probably not going to make a multi-row. Second, if you are doing it on a tripod, just keep your head level. Don't tip up, tilt up, or tilt down. And we'll mention this again later, but in the daytime, it's okay to overlap 20 to 30% and 50% during the nighttime. If you want to overlap 50% all of the time, just to make it easy, please feel free. That's what I do. When you must tile or cannot capture what you see, then it's time to upgrade to a leveling head and a nodal rail or a panorama rig. So let's talk a little bit more about the why here. I've been practicing panoramas for a while, and lately I've been focusing on the insights that I get from the practice. And I realized that panoramas are not actually what I do. And panoramas are not actually my goal. They're just one tool in a toolbox full of tools. But I do specifically use panoramic techniques just to render a desired field of view that I can't make with a single image, period. And essentially, it might sound complicated, but panoramic methods are very simple: capturing and stitching multiple overlapping images together. That's it, right? The devil's in the details. And we'll talk about that, but the process is simple: overlap images while you're capturing them, and you can stitch them together. Now, there's a lot of benefits to using the panoramic capture method, right? Number one, chief among them, is increased resolution. If you have, let's say, a 24 megapixel camera like the Z6 series that I have, you can turn that into a megapixel beast by creating panos. And you can also, and this is chief among my reasons for doing it, is I can control the perspective, and I can make it look natural, or I can make it look fantastic. I can go either way with it, but I'm in control of the perspective. And third, the combined result is either more natural looking or fantastic, depending on your goals. So these are the simplest ways to think about why to pan out, because they're true benefits. Here is, we'll kick it off with a simple example. Here's an HDR during an almost sunset where I put on a 15 millimeter lens, and I wanted to try and capture the entire Snake Mountain range out at Great Basin National Park. But even with a 15 millimeter lens, I couldn't do it. So I got all of this foreground and some crepuscular rays through the clouds there. But when I sat down and made a pano, and this is also an HDR, I could get from the start to the end of the mountain range, which was the goal. And I had to use an HDR capture method because the contrast was so great. I would have lost shadows or highlights. So I shot pano brackets for each of the pano positions. So the benefit of doing this is you can see when you compare them that it's quite different. A single image just couldn't encompass the width that I wanted to do, right? And it also introduced a whole lot of uninteresting foreground elements. And that particular location didn't have a lot of interesting foreground elements. The mountain range was the purpose of the photograph. So when I made the pano, it de-emphasized the less interesting foreground. Another opportunity here is when you just make a simple pano. I call a simple pano a 1 or a 2 or a 3 panel pano. Maybe you just want a little bit wider field of view. When this light was happening over in Arches National Park, it was, it was beautiful, but it was moving fast. And I had a 250 millimeter telescope on. So I did my best to take 2 pictures quickly because the sun was moving behind some clouds. So yes, it's badly captured. However, I could stitch those 2 images together, and I could use the fill option in Photoshop to take the corners that were sort of messed up, and I'll go back and show you that. So there's a little bit missing in the top left and the bottom right, and I use a fill function to fill those in and patch them up. And I got a 2 panel pano with a 250, and the detail is remarkable. So, but I did it sort of cowboy style because the light was changing. So in that case, the impetus to move away from being entirely accurate was something very timely was happening. So again, no judgments. If you got to shoot the pictures, you got to shoot the pictures. Just shoot them. Another huge benefit is the increase in resolution without adding megapixels to your camera, of course. This is basically looks like a standard aspect ratio, like 35 millimeter image, but it's 17,845 pixels wide by 11,115 pixels tall. And if we punch in on it, we could see that there's 100% crop of some of the visitors to this location at Mesa Verde. And it's pretty remarkable that you can get something that is not only this was HDR plus a multi-row pano, but you could have the ability to make a very large print of this or look at the details on your screen. And I had to set up right over the railing like this to capture it with a 24-70 lens. So all these were shot at 70 millimeters. Another huge benefit is when you're trying to shoot time shifted blends. So here I am at Capitol Reef National Park, over at the goosenecks within the park. And you got to walk a little bit to get to this location, but I really, really, really wanted to capture a blended twilight and later on Milky Way core shot right over the center part of this. So the result was this. And yeah, I'm still kind of working on the final edit on this. I feel like it's dark, but I was able to photograph this deep, deep canyon, which under starlight is almost impossible to get detail in. I got it with late twilight light, so it's relatively shadowless, but you see a little bit of the alpenglow, I'm going to call it, on the left-hand rocks there, where the brightness of the sky was reflected off of the face of those rocks. But I also got to wait about 2 hours for the Milky Way to come over across to that one point that I wanted, and then I shot more. So I had 2 rows of 9 images on the bottom part, just to get all of the detail that I needed in the landscape. And then I had 2 rows of images on the top part that were shot for star points. And all of those were processed together in PT GUI and exported separately as different layers and blended in Photoshop. So in this case, I'm trying to make something that looks natural, even though it's impossible to take a single photograph that looks like this. The intent is to make it look as natural as possible. And without panoramic techniques, I wouldn't have the perspective control or the accuracy to come back and shoot the exact same scene later and have all the details at the horizon line, the transition zone, match up. So that's what this is for. Also, like in this perspective, I was standing at the end of a pretty long hike at Great Basin National Park up at the bristlecones there, and kind of exhausted and looking at this scene and saying, oh gosh, I was so slow that I got here after twilight. I have to shoot this scene under starlight, which isn't a problem. It just wasn't ideal. So I had to negotiate the boundaries in front of me. So I had 2 challenges here. One is I was facing up a pretty steep slope, and I didn't want the trees to tilt in towards each other. So I wanted perspective control. I wanted the trees to remain upright and parallel. Now, the bristlecone goes off in crazy directions, but if you look at the other trees, they're straight and parallel. I also needed to take longer exposures for the foreground to have enough light hit my sensor so that it wasn't crazy noisy. So in the foreground, I made 4 images in 1 row that included all of the trees in the foreground. And then for the sky, I waited for the Milky Way to come around to that notch. And then I made 2 rows of 4, one for the first part of the stars, and then a little bit further up to get more of the Milky Way core there. So panoramic techniques allowed me to create a natural looking scene in a very challenging environment. And if I wanted to get a huge field of view, like when we had the one of the latest coronal mass ejections of the sun, and we had an aurora event during the Perseids meteor shower in Great Basin National Park, we had wild colors all over the sky. So this is probably 190, 200 degree field of view from left to right and very high up in the sky, almost the zenith. And I wanted to capture all of that, and I had to use a Pano rig to do it. I could have shot it with 1 lens, but it would have caused some distortions, which we will explore a little bit later. But it looks much more natural in a very unnatural situation this way. There's much less distortion than there could have been. And then when you want to deliberately distort things, yes, you can use single shot dual lens cameras like an Insta360 or a Theta, or you can get much higher quality, better stitched images by using a Pano rig and practically any lens. But in this case, I used a fisheye lens, the Nikon 8 to 15 millimeter at 8 millimeter fisheye. And I made this in 6 images. So I was able to capture 4, one on each of the cardinal points, one straight up and one straight down. Those 6 images together create this spherical panorama, affectionately called a tiny planet. I'm sorry. I made this with a 15 millimeter lens. Sometimes I use my fisheye lens to get things in 6 images. With the 15 millimeter lens, you have to shoot many more images because the field of view is, much less. So, all right, let's move on and talk about the part where we start to relate to each other more, because it might feel like a lot of these things are out of reach. That doing cool panos is really hard. It isn't. You just need to work through it. So let's talk about the 18 easy steps it took for me. And trust me, this will all make sense. So the first thing that happened was I wanted to make a pano, and I said, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm doing it anyway. Does this sound familiar? Right? Besides, how complicated can it be anyway? That's the hubris right there. The end result was number 2. It works sometimes, but I'm kind of encouraged, so I'm going to keep trying, right? And then the third thing is like, oh, well, the photographer in me says, I want to understand why it didn't work. So I put some effort into learning more about it and how to do it better next time. And I learned about things like nodal rails and stuff. So the fourth part happened where I decided to stop cowboying it, like shooting from the hip and saying, ooh, I could figure this out. It's probably going to work. And I started thinking about what the actual math is that's involved in this, the field of view of a lens, right? And staying level. If you don't stay level, it kind of throws everything else off. It makes everything else unenjoyable when you're trying to stitch. So I learned the importance of that. So here's definitely a cowboy pano. I shot this a long, long time ago. First time I went to Yosemite, and if I went back and did it again, I would put my camera in vertical orientation, not horizontal. That was a really amateur mistake. This is also shot in JPEG. I would shoot raw, right? And I would pay attention to the start and stop locations, but I did overlap pretty well. I eyeballed it. I said, I roughly need 50%, and that's roughly what I did. So I could stitch a pano. Cool, it worked, right? Hey, that's encouraging. Not the best pano, but it proves that I was at Yosemite. So it did its job. Then I visited Badlands National Park, and I made this pano. And because the head could spin all the way around, I took all the pictures all the way around. And gosh, I learned a lot from this one. One is it's really hard to look at. It's so narrow that it's hard to look at the details. So I went back and I re-edited it today, actually. And you can see up top is how I originally edited it, and down bottom is how I edited it today. It's 100% due to the experience that I've earned practicing pano photography, but you got to just shoot it to learn from it. You can't learn from books or webinars alone. So whatever you get out of this, I want you to take this away, that it's really important to just try, shoot it, stitch it, learn from it. And then you can come back when you have better information or practices or software or even capture devices. You can possibly reprocess or reshoot some things that were precious to you. So look at this. There's a ton of images there. I think I overshot it. I think I put too much in each frame, but you know what? It still works. It stitches. So, and the re-edit was much more successful. I think it's more fun to look at, but it's still, even on the screen that you're looking at, it's probably hard to look at because you have to turn your eyes left to right to see all the details. So it got me thinking about aspect ratios. Step number 5, I realized that just a little bit of gear could help me realize the process, to enjoy the process more. So I got an L bracket for my camera, which every camera I get now has an L bracket because it makes life easier, period, end of sentence. I also got a nodal rail, which as soon as I had stitching errors where things in the foreground just didn't stitch together and I didn't know how to fix it and I had to fudge around in Photoshop, that nodal rail helped fix that. And then I started actually flipping my ball head over and turning it into a leveling head instead. And that made everything really great. And I started making much more successful single row panos. And we'll talk more about that. And then I got step number 6. I got my first pano rig. And honestly, initially I was very confused. So, you know, I had to work. I had to work to understand it. For the calibration, finding your no parallax point, finding the angle of view, all that, those things you have to learn. There's a learning curve. However, I started making more successful panos and vertoramas, and that was extremely encouraging. The more consistently I could make it, the more I wanted to make them. So then I put even more effort into learning about the math involved, and I got really simple about it. And I'm going to share this with you guys. So I was less hurried about making panos after that because I wasn't sort of trying to rush through it. I was enjoying the process because I was more confident, and that helped a lot. And then this insight developed. It was less about making a wider shot than my widest lens could make, and more about looking at a scene and just embracing it and saying, I can do this. I can make you mine. And then learning to make it look natural. Or like I showed you with the tiny planets, fantastic. So that was very helpful. And then I took the math to another level, and I really I figured out the fields of view of everything, and I started writing them down and putting them in a note so I wouldn't have to look them up every time. And then the results got more consistent. And then I started finding limitations to the software I had for stitching, and that was Lightroom Classic and Photoshop. I pushed them to their limits, and I found them lacking. So I had to create some workarounds. And these workarounds I felt pretty good about. Like, oh, I can make the software do things that it couldn't do before by applying some things after it stitches. But then my friend Mike Murray, I remembered that years ago when the cheese grater Max, he had a PT GUI back then, and he was making some tiny planets, which he calls spherescapes. And we'll post a link to Mike's work, which you may enjoy. He's an amazing artist. He showed me PT GUI a long, long time ago, and it scared me. I was not thrilled by what was going on, but computers were really different back then. They're a lot faster now, and PT GUI on a modern computer system is really fun to use once you understand how to do it. So I got PT GUI, I bought it, and I was uncomfortable and uncertain, and I watched all the videos I could, and I figured some things out on my own. I had to look around to see if there's anybody talking about how to use it as a night photographer, and honestly, there's not a lot of information out there. So I just kept shooting and editing and stitching and blending. And then I decided to develop a workshop for national parks at night called the Pano Intensive. And I had to really, really get my stuff together to make sure that I was teaching for other people. And that's where everything got even more clear. So 2 of those Pano Intensives are behind me now, and there's a 3rd next year. And I think every year the process gets clearer. And I really enjoy working with the people that attend that and sharing these insights, and we all grow together. So it's a lot of fun. And really, we're solving visual photographic problems with Pano techniques. So I'm sharing this with you so that you understand that we all come up from a place of wanting to do something better, right? And we can't expect to be an expert when we start. So I want you to be kind to yourself. I want you to choose to embark on the process, knowing that sometimes you're going to be disappointed with the results, but you can learn every time that something doesn't work out. So the road has been long for me. It's certainly not over, and it still delights me. And that's why I like sharing these things with you. I hope that this is inspiring. I hope that these quick 18 steps of becoming a Pano photographer help you find, something within me that resonates with you as I'm looking to resonate with you too. So where should you start if you want to do this? Well, Here's what I say are my fundamental principles of panoramic photography. And if you're going to screenshot something, this is a good place to start. Always overlap enough to stitch between the frames. That's either side to side or up and down. So you need to overlap in both directions if you're doing a multi-row. You need to always stay level, or you're going to be cropping your hard work. I'm going to show you some examples of this a little bit later. We're going to get some visuals in here, right? But staying level is really important. The panning should be above the level, and we'll talk more about that. You should use manual exposure. You should use manual white balance and shoot raw. You should be in control. Never use automatic features. You should definitely check your focus and your exposure before committing to a whole pano sequence, because I've shot sequences that I was in a rush to do and I had to throw them away later because they were slightly out of focus, or I kind of forgot to check the exposure. So I've made all of the mistakes, or most of them. I'm sure I'm going to make more in the future. I just want you to avoid them if you can. So check your work, check your test shots before you commit. If you're in a high contrast situation, capture bracketed exposures for each pano position so you can do HDR processing later. This will help you, especially if you're doing time shifted blends, because the transition from the lightest part of where the sky meets the land, that should be relatively the same value as the sky that meets it. It can't be really bright on the ground and really dark in the sky. It'll look weird. So HDR can help you with that. And always shoot 1 to 2 extra overlap frames beyond the most important thing at your right and left edges and the top and bottom. Top and bottom, you can just do 1 extra, but right and left do 2, especially if you're going up, because it's going to keystone. So how much should you overlap? In daylight, there's a lot more detail. There's a lot more information for the stitching software to match up and stitch. So 20 to 30% is sufficient for daytime photographs. But if you shoot night photography where there's a lot less detail, especially in the shadows, you should definitely overlap 50%. That's your hedge to make sure that you can stitch it later, and that all the time you put into trying to make a pano instead of one image, a single composition, was worth it. In the daytime, you can eyeball it. You can take a picture and then look and see what's on the right-hand edge and then rotate it so that that thing's in the middle, and then take another picture and then rotate the camera so that thing's in the middle and take another picture. At night, you can't do that because there's so little light and the cameras can't really show you all of that detail. So it's better to do it by the numbers. That means going into photo pills, and I'm going to show you what that means, or your user manual, and finding out what the field of view is for that lens. You can also use your smartphone. And this is a really clever trick. You may or may not have thought of this, but of course, each lens on your smartphone has an equivalent focal length to full frame 35 millimeter, which most of us shoot. If you shoot crop sensor, you'll do the math a little bit differently, but I'm going to speak as if we're all shooting full frame. So my Apple iPhone 13 Pro Max has 3 lenses, a 13 millimeter, a 26, and a 77. And if you go into photo pills to the focal length match, you can put in your phone and one of the lenses and your camera, and you can see where they match up. Now, it's in the name, so you might not need to go all the way here, but if you find out what it is, you can say, oh, roughly one of them's 13 millimeters or 12, right? Which for me, I use a 12 millimeter lens pretty often, and one is 26 and one is 77. So that when you take your camera out on your smartphone and you put it in pano mode, you can see the 0.5 by is the widest lens. That equals a 12 millimeter. Start thinking in terms of what your big camera can do. So if that's a 12 millimeter and you make a pano sweep, you know what using a 12 millimeter on your big camera would do. And so on. With the 1 by, it's a 26, which is pretty close to a 24 millimeter, which I use most of the time. And the longer lens, the 3 by, is a 77. So you can use this to go out and simulate what you want to do. You can go out and scout for panos in the future. During the daytime, you can scout for night panos, or you can just use it to creatively explore different camera positions without having to set up your tripod and take the picture and then go process it and find out you didn't like it and you should have been 3 feet to the left or 1 foot down, or etc. So your smartphone can be a really valuable tool in pano mode. The field of view pill in photo pills is a great way to get really specific about what you need. It's highlighted here. It's called FOV, short for field of view. If you tap on that and you go in, you just choose your camera model at top in the upper right-hand corner, and then you enter your lens focal length, top left, and then you choose portrait on the right-hand side, because we turn our cameras vertically to take panoramas. We're not talking about vertiramas right now. And then that top line says your horizontal angle of view. So for instance, the 15 millimeter, the first example here, that says 77 degrees. If I cut that in half, it's roughly 37 degrees. So I need to rotate the panorama base 37 degrees roughly every time I want to do it. If I want a 50% overlap, I can be as close to that as possible. The 24 millimeter is 52, so I can go roughly 25 degrees. And a 50 millimeter is 26.88 degrees, so I can go maybe 13 degrees. So this is how you figure out how much you have to rotate to overlap 50%. Hope that helps. If you overshoot it, like I did in the beginning when I was a young budding pano photographer, I overlapped too much. I figured I'd hedge my bets. Guess what? It stitches, right? Some software like Lightroom might choke on it and say, I can't do that. That's too much information. They won't tell you this. It's too much information. What they want is just enough to overlap, not too much. This happens to be screenshots from PT GUI. But if I go in and I eliminate some of those, it'll still stitch. And you can see there's faint red lines here, right? I'm going to go back one to show you. You see the faint red lines? Those are the stitch lines that PT GUI is showing me. And you can see how many of them are. It's using something from every single image here. And when I eliminate half of the images, those stitch lines just get further apart. So it's still using those and making an accurate pano either way. So if you overshoot it, don't worry. You can just use every other. All right. Let's get to the nuts and bolts of it. Your first option is to cowboy it. And by cowboying it, I mean, you don't have any other option but to hand hold your pano. You're going to shoot it from the hip. That might be for a number of reasons. You can do it with a cell phone. A lot of people do that. And I just explained it's a great way to see your pano opportunities. You can scout that way. Hand holding with a camera is the next step. And that's when you hold your camera and turn, right? You should adopt a proper stance and try and rotate. Imagine that there's a post going down from the center of your lens to hit the ground, and try and rotate around your lens instead of turning your body this way, especially if you have things in your foreground. But if you have important things in your foreground, you probably shouldn't be cowboying it anyway. You should shoot it and see if it stitches, but there's a chance that those things that are close to you will be in different places versus the background, causing stitching errors. That's what parallax does. You should put your elbows in and try and rotate, right? Putting your camera on a tripod and rotating the panoramic base on your ball head is a much better alternative to cowboying it if you can, right? So the negatives to this is it might not stitch, right? But if you just got to shoot it because you have no alternative, just do it. So here's an example of when there's no alternative. This is from Lehman Caves at Great Basin National Park. And we were on a tour. It was a timed tour. And I was the last person. And they were yelling at me to move on. So I shot this 8-image pano, leaned up against the railing, and rotating as close to the center of the lens as I could. It's a 10 millimeter lens. There was nothing close by, so there's no parallax. And this is what the stitch without cropping looks like. So this is a screenshot from PT GUI. And this is what the final edited stitch looks like. And you may never know that this was a handheld pano, but I banged it out. I was pretty happy. I didn't know if it was going to work. I tried my best to employ everything I know about making good panos when I was cowboying it. So again, no judgments. I'm not going to get mad at anybody for panoing it or judge them. So there are some common limitations to using just a single lens. And they include the following things: lens distortions. It could be barrel or pin cushion or other kinds of distortions that lenses have. Especially the wider you go, the more likely you are to have distortions. Keystoning, converging lines, parallel lines converging as you tilt upwards or downwards. And then your camera is exactly the megapixels it is. You can't make it any more megapixels unless you have like pixel shift shooting, or you make a pano, right? So here is, when I tilt my camera back, this is what I get. You see how that cell tower tilts in. That's the keystoning effect, right? But this is the field of view that I wanted. This is a 3-panel pano where the camera was level and it was just wider. And you notice how the tower is straight up and down. And when I crop it, it's the same field of view, but the perspective is correct. If I had adjusted that other image, and I'm going to go back, I would have to crop it. I'd have to shoot this wider and then crop it. So I'd be at much less than 24 megapixels. But instead, I now have a really clean image where everything looks correct. And if you put them side by side, you could see that shooting a pano solved a visual problem here. So that really worked out. Also, another example of keystoning is a Vertorama. On the left, you'll see a single image, 37 millimeters, and the trees are tipping in. You know, it's not wrong. It's what happens when you tilt the camera backwards, but we kind of want trees to be straight. So on the right, the trees are straight, and I used a Vertorama. I had the camera horizontal, and I took 1, 2, 3, 4 images and stitched them together as a pano, and I just held on the top image to make star trails. So that right there, I think, is a more pleasing image, and it's definitely what I wanted to achieve. Lens distortions. Now, this is shot with a 15 millimeter. You might not immediately understand, but there are some distortions here, and the lens is kind of level. It might be tilted back a tiny bit. I made a pano with a 70 millimeter lens, and the camera's vertical, and I was panning horizontally. There's no distortion. And here's the difference. Take a look at where the arrows are pointing. You'll see that the houses, which are definitely parallel, are sort of squished and tilting on the top image, which is a crop of the 15 millimeter single shot. But when I made the 70 millimeter pano on the bottom, everything looks natural. It looks almost architectural. So you can maintain your perspective this way. So now we're getting out of, talking about what the issues with a single image are and cowboying it. And we're getting to option number 1, which I call good. Good is you have a tripod, you have a ball head. That's 99% of us, right? You need to level your tripod legs independently, which is sometimes a pain in the butt. But you need to level the tripod first, and then the ball head goes on top of that, and you need to level the ball head. Not every ball head has a bubble level on top, but your camera probably has a leveling device built into it. So you can use the camera if you don't have that, or get a third-party 3-way bubble level and put it on your hot shoe. Anyway, you got to level the ball head above that. Once your tripod is level and your ball head is level, then anything you rotate above that is going to be level. It won't tilt to the left and tilt up to the right because tripod, ball head, level. So you can just mount your camera vertically and turn it this way and overlap 50% and take your pictures. You could turn the camera sideways. You could turn the ball head sideways and put your camera vertically that way if you put it in the notch. But then you're sort of rotating around the outside of the ball head, which is a little worse than just being on the top of the ball head. But it'll still get the job done, in many cases, right? So in this case, you're just going to do that and you're going to stitch everything together. This is what it looks like, right? So a tripod level, ball head level, camera on top, using the pano base that's at the bottom. Now, I could have been drawing before, and I'll draw now. So this is the pano base right here. Let's do that. And undo that, change the color here to something we can see. There we go. So there we go. So that's the panning knob right there. And we're simply, rotating this around that way. So excuse my primitive drawing. So this is simple. Everybody can shoot panos this way. And what you really want to do in this case is use a wide enough lens that you can crop out the parts that you don't like. You're already making a bigger image by shooting a pano. So yeah. What you don't want to do is put really interesting things very close to your lens, because you're going to induce parallax, and that might cause unrecoverable stitching errors. So be careful. If something seems to be too close to you, maybe you want to step back away from it a little bit, or move to the left or the right and not include it in the scene. I know photographically that might be less interesting to you, but it's more interesting than not being able to stitch the pano or have to fabricate something to replace the stitching error. So also, you don't want to tilt back. You want to stay level. So if you need more sky or more foreground, put a wider lens on and shoot the pano that way. So this is the first option. This is good. Everybody can do this. You'll always get great panos this way. But if you tilt back, this is what's going to happen. And I see a lot of people do this, and they wonder why their panos might not be what they hoped they would be. So you'll see on the bottom, you have a very natural looking pano. That road actually did curve there. It wasn't straight. But on top, you'll notice that the horizon line is going like this. It's like a curvy smile, right? But over here, the horizon line is dead straight like that. And that's really important. And also, you're starting to get distortions in things that shouldn't have distortions. So tilting back on a ball head starts to give you yaw, and that doesn't help with stitching a good pano. Incidentally, if you did that, you could recover from it by not with Photoshop, not with Lightroom, but with PT GUI. You could stitch it with PT GUI, and then you drag the project up like this until the horizon line matches the horizon line in the Panorama editor like that. And then you can make it look good. But the problem is you now have to crop it, so you're losing a lot of that stuff that you saw. So like I said before, it's probably better just to stay level and use a slightly wider focal length and crop the things you don't want. Now you're just losing opportunity here. Like if you really wanted that person in the bottom left-hand corner, you might be out of luck, or you might have to move them fictitiously. So moving on. It's good to use a tripod with a ball head. It's great for single rows, no near objects. We said that. It's not good for foregrounds, right? So let's move on from here. Option number 2 is better. If you had a tripod and you added a leveling base on top of that, and then added a pano base on top of that, and a nodal rail, this would help out. And I'm going to show you in the next slide what this looks like. But essentially, you can flip over some ball heads, like Novoflex's classic ball, and then it changes into a leveling head. Or you can use a dedicated leveling accessory called a leveling head. Using a nodal rail eliminates parallax, which is stitching errors, right? For many panos that don't have near objects, you never need to worry about this. But the nodal rail helps when you do have near objects and you're trying to make an interesting balanced composition that has foreground elements. Multi-row panos is doable with this, but it's hard, especially if you have a ball head, because you can't control whether you're tilting left or right. So I don't advise it. But for single row panos, this is the better option. And this is what it looks like. On the left is using some Novoflex parts to make a nodal rail. And on the right is an Acrotech nodal rail that I've had for years. Both of them get the job done. But what you're really looking at here is offsetting your camera so that the entrance pupil or the no parallax point of your camera is around the center of the rotation point. That's what eliminates parallax. And we've done some other presentations describing parallax. I don't want to go into it in depth here, but essentially you can demonstrate it to yourself by holding your thumb out and closing one eye and noting where your thumb is and what it's over in the background, and then closing that eye and opening the other, and you'll see the thumb jump back and forth. That is what parallax is. And when you use a nodal rail, you can eliminate that so that this virtual thumb that we're talking about, your near foreground object doesn't, it moves with the background as you pan past it. So the alternative to this is you can add a panorama base on top of your ball head. So in this case, nothing changes. You still level the tripod legs, you level the ball head, and you can mount the pano base on top of that. Now, what is a pano base? Well, the pano base is this object right in here. And I'm going to circle it and all of these so you can see it. The pano base is simply a rotational device because, yeah. So in this, we have a ball head and standard orientation over here, right? If I was not able to level the tripod legs, then I could use the ball head here to level. And then everything above this right here will rotate levelly, and I can shoot a pano that's worth it. Also here, and now we'll clear all that. This ball head inverted is essentially now a leveling head, right? So now that this is level, I add the rotating here, and I can go. Now, you might argue that I don't need to because this already has a rotating head. You're absolutely right about that. So and it also has a clamp right here. So this is a little bit superfluous here, but I just wanted to show you that as an accessory, it fits in many places. Or let's say you have a tripod and then you have a magic ball like this, and there's a clamp on top of the magic ball. This right here is the rotating head. So the magic ball doesn't have a rotation device on it. So I just added a quick release clamp and then the rotation device. And then I can make really wonderful single row panos with this. So that's how that works. So here's some simple pano bases from Novoflex. They have no click stops. They're just smooth. They have two things. They have a few things. They have a scale, so you can see how many degrees you're turning. There's a reference point right there, so you can use that as a start and stop point. This is the locking knob. I recommend using it between shots, especially if you take long exposures. They have a wonderful bubble level at the top, so you can make sure everything's level before you rotate. And it has this great quick release clamp built into it. There's two models. This one right here has a dovetail on the bottom, an Arca Swiss, and this one has a flat bottom on it. So you can screw it directly to the top of something, say a ball head or a tripod or a leveling head. So these are wonderful. If you just want to add something in that gives you pano abilities, you can add one of these guys and you're good. If you wanted to have click stops, which I recommend for night photography or people that make tons of panos, here's three different opportunities. The difference, these two on the left are essentially the same thing, except that they have different click step values. So you'll see that this one has 22 and a half. Sorry, I say this one. The Q48 has 22 and a half and 12 degrees, 10 degrees, and 7.5, which makes it better for wide angle lenses. And then the Q68 has 60, 45. Actually, I have to reverse that and say it. The Q68 is better for wide angle lenses, and the Q48 is better for longer focal lengths. And if you want to use everything from super wide lenses to very long focal lengths, the biggest option is the Q Pro 2. So you can add this to anything. You can add any of these to anything and add click steps to everything. And I say that this makes pano life very easy. So if you wanted a simple upgrade, one of these would be great. and you can put your L bracket in this and go to town. Or you can put your nodal rail and an L bracket in this and go to town. So this is how you would add this to single row panos. The only difference here on this one is that you see I have added an MBAL 20 here, which is a leveling head. So all of these are acting as leveling heads. The magic ball, the inverted classic ball, and the MBAL 20 are all acting as leveling heads, which is important for single row panos. The third option, and arguably the best option, and I'm saying this from lots of experience, is to get a tripod, a leveling head, and a panorama rig. It's very simple. It might be larger to use than other things and more to carry, but it gives you the most flexibility, the most reliability, and I think that you're going to really grow into it, as I have. You can use any lens whatsoever to create images. So every lens becomes a panel lens. The negatives to this is you have to find your no parallax point for all your focal lengths if you have near foreground objects. But honestly, it's once you understand how to do it, it's very simple, and you write down those values and you always set it up for those lenses the same way, and you're done. So it's not a big deal, but it's something you need to learn. And then using it, you really have to get up to speed, because you have to calibrate it to the size of your camera, your body size, just making sure that the X and Y axes are centered. And then you just need to start using it and understanding how to set it up. You may use one or two focal lengths in the beginning and use more in the end, but you can take any pano with any lens with this. So I am enchanted with using pano rigs. This is my everyday setup, and we'll talk more about the details of this. But starting from the bottom up, we have a tripod, and then we have a balancing head, and then we have a pano rig. And you can see the big deal here is that everything is pivoting around here on the vertical axis. So you can see that everything is through that no parallax point, and everything rotates around the center point here. So that's why you can make successful panos with this. This is a TrioPod M and an MBAL 20. So this is a great kit to have. And this is a TrioPod Pro 75 with an MBAL 75, which is made for that tripod, and the Pro HD pano rig. So this just happens to handle heavier duty stuff. The VR System Slim, which we have here, is made for most mirrorless systems, up to maybe a 7200, maybe a 7 at the most. But once you want to use longer lenses, which have much narrower fields of view, you need to use the HD, the Pro 2 HD. It's going to have not only better grip, it's stronger, but finer controls over the field of view. So what about motorized trackers? Some might say, well, there's things like the Benro Polaris. It is an XYZ device, but it can't eliminate parallax. I've used it, and I've had to fix parallax errors when I've made spherical panos with it. So I would suggest shooting your skies tracked with that and shooting your foreground panos with a rig so that you don't have stitching errors, and then blending them separately. Products like the Gigapan, they do correct for parallax, but they're gigantic. They're complex and they're bulky. Not saying that they're bad. It's just for a certain kind of person who wants to make super, super huge, very detailed panos. These are the rigs. You might want to say, what's it all look like together? So let's put all of this into terms of products. Yes, I'm a big fan of Novoflex. I appreciate their support over the years. They've supported my cameras and they've supported me. And I love teaching. But honestly, I think that a lot of the things that I do are done better because I have great gear. So let's look at these one by one. And again, this is going to be in a replay so you can see it. The first single row kit is pretty simple. We have a TrioPod M at the bottom here, right? Nice strong tripod. Then you could use a magic ball right there. And then the Q mount is the quick release right there. And then this is the Panorama QC. And above that is a camera with an L bracket. Assume everything has a camera with an L bracket. So in a sense, you would be using the magic ball to level, and then you'd be panning with this. So that one works out really great. Nice and strong. The second one is, same thing. Use any tripod, but the TrioPod M is this kit right here. Use a classic ball too. And then the Q mount right there. So in this case, I had to level the tripod as we talked about before. And then I could use the panning knob right here to make panos because everything above it was level after I leveled the legs. And sorry for my crude drawing there. And then the third single row kit that I'd recommend is, a good strong tripod like the TrioPod M, and then adding above that a balancing head. So in this case, it's the MBAL 20, which means it has 20 degrees of balancing action in any direction. And then here is the fantastic new geared head from Novoflex called the Kopf squared. This is the basic version. It has a rotating base on it. And you'll see that the Pano rotator is part of the base. And it has a quick release up at the top. So now that you've done that, you have two options. You can just mount the L bracket right there directly onto the Kopf, and then use the rotation down here to rotate around the center, make single row panos without a foreground. Or you can add a nodal rail and then offset it for the no parallax point and make great single row panos with this option that don't have parallax stitching errors. So that is wonderful. And you've got the best, and I rarely ever use that word. You've got the best geared head on the market. It's absolutely incredible. And then you can look at my daily use Pano kit. For over 2 years, I've taken this around the world. I have the Trio Balance tripod, which has the balancing head built into the tripod spider because I make panos all the time. So in this case, the Trio Balance is what I use. And then I put the Cubase 2 quick release accessory on top of that, which Robert Thompson introduced me to, and I thank him for it. As soon as I saw how reliable and impossible to accidentally unlock that is, I put it on my tripods. And then the VR System Slim Pano kit, which really helped me understand the beauty of panorama photography. And I've, again, taken this whole thing all around the world and beat it up. And it still is performing like the day that I bought it. It has a click stop base, and I swear by it. This is this kit right here made me love panos, and I continue to love panos because of it. So I use it on my mirrorless kits with practically every lens, except for I stop at 70-200. And then I got a Z8 and some longer lenses, and I upgraded to also using the VR Pro 2 HD. And that's the Pano rig that you see from here up. Everything here is the VR Pro 2 HD. That is mounted on top of the heaviest tripod that Novoflex has, which is the TrioPod Pro 75, and the accessory that's it doesn't need to be dedicated to that, but it fits inside of the tripod spotter here, which is the MBAL Pro 75. So that means that I can set up this tripod on any surface and then level it out, and then I can make a pano with absolutely any lens with this super strong click stop enabled pano kit. And it has click stops on the vertical axis, and it has click stops on the horizontal axis also. And I adore using this kit too. Whenever possible, I travel with both tripods and both pano kits because I'm that freaky. I make a lot of panos. All right, we've covered a lot of ground here. I want to leave you with some takeaways. I think it's really important to not get bogged down in the details. I think that when you see an opportunity to pano, you should cowboy it. Just shoot it, and don't sweat that you might need, something more to do it. Get the shots, stitch them, and learn from them. Getting that is more important than, especially if the light is changing. Just get the shots, right? And then take what you've learned here and just try and capture the best shots you can. Also, get to know your lenses, know what your field of view is on your lenses, and how much they distort, and how much they distort if you tilt them. Uh, you know, and also, honestly, use what you have until you need it to perform better or more consistently. At that point, when the pain becomes so great or your annoyance becomes so high, that's a great time to invest wisely in a system or components that lead to everything that you want, and some things that can work with your style or grow as you expand. Novoflex is a great opportunity here. And I unabashedly say it's wonderful to know that all of the pieces just work together and you can plan piece by piece to grow into the system of your dreams. So I hope that I've given a lot of details here. I'm also going to post links to all of the objects, whether it be individual pieces or kits or stuff like that I've mentioned in the replay. And we can put some of that stuff in the chat too. So, and you also need to think about whether, single row panos is what you want to do, or if you want to get into multi-row panos. That's going to affect what system you decide to use. And definitely start with single row panos until you're annoyed or you run into a situation where you have to make them. For me, it was when the Milky Way was so close to the zenith that I had to tilt my camera way, way up to capture those stars. And then you need to think about click stops. There are some bases that Novoflex offers that are smooth pano bases. They're absolutely wonderful. But if you're going to do work that needs to be repeatable, or you're working at night and you don't want to turn your flashlight on at all the time, click stops are absolutely wonderful. They changed my life. They make me able to make time shifted panoramas that thrill me, and I can start and stop in the same place all the time because the click stops allow me to do that. Processing, I'd love to talk about processing, but we already hit an hour here. It's too important to gloss over. So there are some other webinars that we've done, and I forgot to put a number there. They're down below. There's some other webinars that we have here that we will post in the chat and also post in the recap in the description on YouTube that you can click through to see, such as Tim Cooper talking about blending night sky panoramas in PT GUI, and a previous presentation I made in 2 parts before about how to plan, shoot, and edit a blended day and night single row pano photo. So those are good takeaways to have. And now I'm going to take a deep breath and I'm going to go check to see what the Q&A says. And if you haven't asked a question, now is a good time to start typing. So I'm going to go check in here. Javaco, I think I said your name correctly. If I didn't, please don't lambaste me for it. He asks, do you use a standard lens or a perspective control lens? I use a standard lens. The PC or perspective control lenses, I have an issue with them. They're typically not fast enough for me. As an astro landscape photographer, I usually like to shoot at f2.8 or faster. And also, they're not always as wide as they could be for me. However, I do have associates, partners at national parks at night that do use them to photograph lighthouses, for instance, and do enjoy them. But they're typically like an f4.5 instead of a 2.8. So I think that perspective control lenses are a great idea. And that's another, thank you for mentioning that. If you have a perspective control lens or buy a used one or something like that, it's a great way to make a quick 2-shot pano, or perhaps a 4-shot if you go in all directions by shifting it. So great question. Thank you. Chuck asks, how would you find the no parallax point for a view camera lens? That is an awesome question, Chuck. I love that. You would mount that view camera uh, on something where you can slide the whole view camera back and forth while setting up something in front of the view camera that allows you to see whether this object in the foreground moves or not. The challenge with that is going to be multitudinous. The first thing is you need to find an object that you can see through a view camera glass. So you're going to have to pump a lot of light onto that object, and you're going to make sure that that object and what's behind it are kind of relatively equal light value, so that it's not so bright that you can't see if it's moving or not. Some view cameras have a separate clamp on the base rail, and you can move that instead. Or you might have to clamp the whole thing on a rail that moves back and forth. And you could use a focusing rail for macro or a larger rail, but you're just going to need to move the camera in and out and then rotate it on a pano base until you see whether this object moves in parallel with the background, or, in parallax with the background. So that's a great question. I think you're just going to have to do it carefully and methodically. I use a kebab skewer. I keep a pack of those in the workshop kit so I can help other people. And I usually tape it to the edge of a table. You can put it on a little clamp and put it, about yay far from the camera, maybe 2 feet, depending on your focal length. Hope that helps, Chuck. Love that question. Paige has asked 3 questions. First one, will the Pano rigs allow you to shoot panos with a tracker? Well, that is, if the tracker is tilting, then no, because if you're putting a Pano rig on top of a tracker that has a dead level surface on top, you probably could, but it seems like overkill. But yes, you totally could. If you had a very strong Astro tracker, a beefy one that could handle a big payload, which a lot of these could, because they can handle very large objectives, telescopes. So you could ostensibly set up a gem, an equatorial mount, and then put something that levels on top of that, and then put the Pano rig on top of that. And while it's tracking, run all of that stuff. I think it's easier to do other things than that. But theoretically, I think it could be done. I haven't tested it, but your question makes sense. And I think the answer is yes. The next question was, how about rotating index heads? They have click stops, and you have one, you're planning to give it a try. So rotating index heads are essentially the same thing as the Novoflex ones. But the Novoflex ones have internal click stops. I think you're referring to the ones that have the screw-in posts on the outside. They do the same job. So if you're looking for that feature, it works. One just works internally with a lever, and the other one just works by unscrewing a post and putting it into another hole. You just need to understand how it works and what angle of view it's giving you. So yeah, give that a try. It works out good. And then the last question, wouldn't you have to tilt the camera up to shoot the sky for the Milky Way? Absolutely. Yeah. And that's where using a Pano rig instead of using a single row setup is superior. In fact, required. If you're going to shoot Milky Way bows or vertoramas, you're going to want something that can get all the way up to the zenith and beyond in some cases. So yes, the Pano rig is, I think, absolutely essential for astro landscape photographers who are shooting Milky Way bows even later in the season, like past April, May, June. Then you're just going to need to go up pretty high in the sky. So I'm going to mark that one as answered. Let's see what else we got going on here in the chat. Cool. I don't see any more cues in the Q&A. Oh, we got one more coming in from Chuck. When shooting panos of architectural subjects, what issue causes parallel lines to curve? Well, in my experience, Chuck, there's a number of things that could cause that. One is you might be too close to your subject, and that's a hard one to recover from. If you have a really wide lens on and you get really close to your subject, you've got distortion from the lens coming on and perspective distortion at the same time. And I don't think any amount of correction in the best stitching program, PTGUI, will get you away from that. So you need to choose the correct position to match your focal length at that point. But for instance, I shoot 80% of my panos with a 24 millimeter. So I might just back up a little bit and put the 24 on and shoot those things. That works, I think, great for exteriors. Interiors, you're going to have to check that out. The second thing that you need to pay attention to is the projection that you use. If you acquire properly, you should be able to use the proper projection during the stitching process to make it look either natural, or if you're making a spherical pano, which is done in realty photography all the time, then that'll work great for their purposes too. It's a combination. It's more choosing the correct projection than it is bad acquisition. And understanding the projections is almost as easy as clicking through them and then changing your field of view to make sure that they match. You'll find the fewest amount of projections in Lightroom Classic. You'll find more of them in Photoshop and the most in PTGUI. And PTGUI, honestly, is just the right task, the right job for that chore. But I think that's going to be the end of it. I really, really, really delighted that so many of you came out today to talk with us. Thank you so much. If you have more questions, then please let us know. I'm going to put this back over here so I can see everything. If you have more questions, hit reply to the email if you got the invitation here. If you're watching this replay on YouTube, please leave a question there. We'll be happy to respond in a timely manner. And I hope that you have a good time getting out there and making panos. I hope that this presentation was enriching for you and inspiring. And if you have more questions, I'd like to know. But in the meantime, clear skies, have great nights and great days, and we'll catch you at the next webinar. Have a great day.